She said I embarrassed her at the family party, so I embarrassed her at her job. The champagne flute slipped from my trembling fingers, shattering against the marble floor of my sister's pristine dining room. The sound cut through the elegant dinner party chatter like a gunshot, and every perfectly made-up face turned toward me with a mixture of shock and barely concealed disgust. But it wasn't the broken glass that made my heart stop. It wasn't even the crimson wine stain spreading across the white Persian rug that probably cost more than my monthly salary. It was the look on my younger sister Victoria's face as she stared at me from across the room, her emerald eyes blazing with fury and something else. Shame. She was ashamed of me. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Seriously, Carmen? Victoria's voice carried across the suddenly silent room, each word dripping with venom. Can you not manage to hold a glass without destroying my home? The laughter that followed from her wealthy friends felt like acid on my skin. But Victoria wasn't done. She never was. I should have known better than to invite someone who shops at thrift stores to a civilized gathering. Maybe next time I'll just send you a picture of the party instead. The room erupted in cruel laughter, and I felt something die inside me. Standing there in my carefully chosen secondhand dress, surrounded by people who saw me as entertainment, I realized that 28 years of sisterhood meant absolutely nothing when reputation was on the line. My name is Carmen Delacroix, and 6 months ago, I thought I knew who I was. I was the responsible sister, the one who put family first, the one who worked double shifts at the medical billing company downtown while Victoria built her empire in pharmaceutical sales. I was the one who never asked for anything, never complained, never made waves. I was also, apparently, the family embarrassment. The evening that changed everything started like so many others. I was sitting in my cramped studio apartment in the less fashionable part of New Orleans, staring at the stack of bills on my kitchen table that served as both my dining room and office. The August heat was suffocating, and my ancient air conditioner wheezed pathetically in the corner, doing little more than moving hot air around the room. My phone buzzed against the chipped Formica surface, Victoria's name flashing across the screen with that same commanding authority she brought to everything in her life. Carmen, darling, I need you to do me the tiniest favor. Victoria's voice was honey sweet, which immediately put me on guard. In our family, sweetness was usually the precursor to demands. Richard's firm is hosting this incredibly important dinner party at our place Saturday night. All the biggest names in the pharmaceutical industry will be there, plus some major investors Richard's been courting for months. I waited, knowing there was more coming. There always was. The thing is, Mom's been asking why you never come to family gatherings anymore, and you know how she gets when she thinks the family isn't united. So I thought this would be the perfect opportunity to kill two birds with one stone. You can show your face, Mom can see we're all one big happy family, and you can meet some real professionals for once. Who knows? Maybe someone will take pity on you and offer you a better job than that dead-end billing position you're stuck in. The casual cruelty in her voice was so familiar I barely registered it anymore. This was how Victoria spoke to me, how she'd always spoken to me. Like I was a charity case she was obligated to help, a burden she carried with martyred patience. But I needed family. After Dad died 2 years ago, Mom had become increasingly fragile, and Victoria and I were all she had left. Family dinners and gatherings were some of the few things that still brought light to Mom's eyes. What should I wear? I asked, already mentally calculating how many meals I'd have to skip to afford something appropriate for one of Victoria's events. Oh, you know, just something nice. Nothing too flashy. Actually, wait. I could practically hear her thinking. I had this dress that I bought for a conference last year but never wore. It's a bit plain for my taste, but it would be perfect for you. Conservative, unremarkable. I'll have it sent over. The dress arrived the next day in a box that probably cost more than my rent. It was beautiful, I had to admit. A deep navy blue that brought out my eyes, with clean lines and quality. Fabric that felt like silk between my fingers. For a moment, I allowed myself to imagine walking into Victoria's house feeling confident, feeling like I belonged. The fantasy lasted exactly as long as it took me to find the price tag still attached to the sleeve. $3,000. Victoria had spent more on a dress she'd never worn than I made in 2 months. I spent the rest of the week preparing. I watched YouTube tutorials on how to style my thick dark hair into something approaching elegance. I practiced walking in the heels Victoria had also sent over, wobbling around my tiny apartment until I could manage them without falling. I researched the pharmaceutical industry, memorizing names and companies and recent developments so I wouldn't sound completely ignorant if anyone actually spoke to me. Saturday evening arrived with the kind of oppressive humidity that made New Orleans summers legendary. I took the bus across town to the Garden District, watching the neighborhoods gradually transform from my working-class corner of the city to the kind of opulence that seemed to exist in a different universe. Victoria's house was an antebellum mansion that Richard had bought and restored with the kind of money that came from charging desperate people outrageous prices for life-saving medications. It was beautiful and cold, all white columns and manicured gardens that looked like they belonged in a magazine rather than being lived in. I stood at the front door for a full minute, smoothing my dress and checking my reflection in the window. One last time. Through the glass, I could see the party in full swing. Women in designer gowns that probably cost more than my car laughed delicately while holding crystal glasses. Men in expensive suits discussed deals and mergers with the casual confidence of people who had never worried about money in their lives. And there was Victoria, holding court in the center of it all, resplendent in emerald green silk that probably cost more than my entire wardrobe. She looked up as I entered, and for just a moment, her face brightened with what might have been genuine pleasure. "Carmen, you made it. And you look." She paused, and I could see her taking in every detail of my appearance. "You look nice. The dress fits well." The faint praise felt like a victory, and I smiled as she led me into the party. For the first hour, things went better than I had dared to hope. I managed to hold conversations about market trends and regulatory changes. I laughed at the right moments and asked appropriate questions. Several people even seemed genuinely interested in my work, though they quickly lost interest when they realized I was in billing rather than development or research. Victoria introduced me to everyone as my sister Carmen. She works in medical administration, which was technically true if you considered medical billing to be administration. She didn't mention that I worked in a windowless office processing insurance claims for $12 an hour, but I was grateful she was acknowledging our relationship at all. The trouble started during dinner. We were seated at Victoria's massive dining room table, 18 people arranged according to some complex social hierarchy that put me near the end, between Richard's nephew Trevor, who was fresh out of business school and eager to network, and Mrs. Bordeaux, a pharmaceutical heiress who spoke only in whispers and treated the wait staff like they were invisible. The conversation had turned to recent industry scandals, specifically a competitor's drug pricing controversy that had made national news. Everyone was talking about how terrible it was for the industry's reputation, how one bad actor could make everyone look like villains. The irony was lost on no one except possibly the people saying it, given that half the table had made their fortunes doing exactly the same thing. "It's all about optics," Richard was saying, cutting into his perfectly prepared beef Wellington. "The public doesn't understand the complexities of drug development. They see a high price tag and assume we're all greedy monsters, but they don't consider the years of research, the failed trials, the regulatory hurdles." Mrs. Bordeaux nodded sagely. "My late husband always said that if people understood the true cost of bringing a medication to market, they'd be amazed we could sell anything at all." I had been quiet for most of the evening, content to listen and learn, but something about the casual dismissal of people's financial struggles hit me wrong. Maybe it was thinking about my own struggles to afford my asthma medication earlier that month. Maybe it was remembering the elderly woman I'd helped at work who'd cried when her insurance denied coverage for her heart medication. Maybe I was just tired of pretending that money didn't matter. But what about people who literally can't afford their medications? I asked, my voice quieter than I'd intended but still carrying in the sudden lull in conversation. "I mean, I understand development costs, but when someone has to choose between their insulin and their rent, doesn't that suggest the pricing model might need adjustment?" The silence that followed felt like a physical weight. I could feel every eye at the table turning toward me, and the expressions ranged from surprise to confusion to outright hostility. Victoria's face had gone completely white, her knuckles standing out sharply where she gripped her wine glass. "Carmen works in billing," she said quickly, as if that explained and excused my comment. "She sees a lot of," she waved her hand, "vaguely difficult situations." Richard cleared his throat. "Well, of course it's tragic when people can't afford their medications. But the reality is that pharmaceutical companies aren't charities. We have shareholders to consider, employees to pay, research to fund. If we gave everything away, there would be no incentive to develop new treatments." "I'm not suggesting giving everything away," I said, feeling heat rise in my cheeks but unable to stop myself. "But maybe there's a middle ground between bankruptcy and reasonable profit margins?" Trevor laughed, the sound sharp and condescending. Spoken like someone who's never run a business. "You can't just decide to charge less because it feels good. This is capitalism, not a charity auction." "I understand capitalism," I replied, my voice getting stronger despite the hostility I could feel building around the table. "I just think, maybe when your product is the difference between life and death, the moral calculations might be a little different than selling I don't know, luxury cars. Moral calculations? Mrs. Bordeaux's whisper had turned cold. Young lady, the pharmaceutical industry has done more to extend and improve human life than any other sector in history. To suggest that we're somehow morally deficient because we expect to be compensated for our contributions is frankly insulting. I should have stopped. I should have apologized and changed the subject and faded back into the background where Victoria clearly thought I belonged. But something in Mrs. Bordeaux's tone, the casual dismissal of people's suffering, the assumption that profit justified any price, made something snap inside me. I'm not questioning your contributions, I said, my voice steady now despite the way my hands were shaking. I'm questioning whether those contributions justify charging a diabetic family $1,000 a month for insulin that costs $12 to produce. I'm questioning whether saving lives should be the most profitable business model in human history. The explosion that followed was immediate and devastating. Voices raised in indignation, accusations of ignorance and socialism and complete misunderstanding of how the world worked. Richard's face had turned an alarming shade of red, and he was gesturing wildly as he explained the complexities of international markets and regulatory approval processes. Mrs. Bordeaux was muttering about the younger generation and their entitled attitudes. Trevor was laughing openly now, sharing glances with the other young executives like they were watching an amusing but embarrassing performance. But it was Victoria's voice that cut through all the others, sharp and furious and filled with a venom I'd never heard directed at me before. That's enough. The words came out like a whip crack, and the entire table fell silent. Victoria was standing now, her emerald dress catching the light from the crystal chandelier, her beautiful face twisted with anger and humiliation. Carmen, I think you've said quite enough for one evening. Victoria, I didn't mean to. You didn't mean to what? Embarrass me in front of my colleagues? Make me look like I come from a family of bleeding heart idealists who don't understand basic economics? You didn't mean to turn my dinner party into a political debate? The room was dead silent now. Even the waitstaff had stopped moving, frozen in place like they were watching a car accident unfold. I could feel my face burning with shame and anger and confusion. All I had done was ask a question, express a concern about people suffering. How had that turned into this? You were just what, Carmen? Trying to show off? Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Trying to prove you're smarter than everyone here? Well, congratulations. You've certainly made an impression. Victoria's voice was getting louder now, losing the controlled composure she usually maintained in front of her important friends. Do you have any idea how long Richard and I have been planning this evening? How important these connections are for our careers? How much work went into making everything perfect? I looked around the table at the faces staring at me. Some looked uncomfortable, others amused, but all of them were clearly seeing me as the problem, the disruption, the person who didn't belong. And in that moment, I realized that Victoria was right. I didn't belong here. I would never belong here. Not because I couldn't afford the right clothes or didn't have the right education, but because I couldn't turn off the part of me that cared about people who weren't in this room. I'm sorry, I whispered, standing up on unsteady legs. I should go. Yes, Victoria said, her voice cold as winter, you should. But she wasn't done. Victoria was never done when she had an audience and a chance to make a point. As I gathered my purse and prepared to leave, she delivered the final blow with surgical precision. You know what, Carmen? This is exactly why I rarely invite you to things like this. You can't help yourself, can you? You see successful people and you just have to tear them down, make them feel guilty for their achievements. Well, here's a newsflash for you. The reason you're struggling isn't because the world is unfair. It's because you refuse to understand how it actually works. The words hit me like physical blows, each one carefully chosen to inflict maximum damage. Around the table, people were nodding in agreement, some looking relieved that someone had finally said what they were all thinking. I was the problem. I was the one who didn't understand. I was the one who didn't belong. That champagne flute, slipping from my trembling fingers, was really just the final punctuation mark on my humiliation. As it shattered against the marble floor, I felt something shatter inside me too. The last of my illusions about family loyalty, about sisterly love, about belonging anywhere in Victoria's carefully constructed world. I left without another word, walking through those pristine streets in my expensive borrowed dress, feeling more alone than I had ever felt in my life. By the time I reached the bus stop, I was crying so hard I could barely see. But underneath the tears, something else was building. Something harder and colder than grief. I rode the bus home in silence, staring out at the passing lights and thinking about the look on Victoria's face when she told her friends I shopped at thrift stores. The casual cruelty of it, the way she had thrown our father's death and our family's financial struggles in my face like they were character flaws rather than tragedies. The way she had made my concern for suffering people sound like a personality disorder. When I finally made it back to my studio apartment, I sat on my secondhand couch in my $3,000 borrowed dress and made a decision. Victoria thought she knew who I was. She thought she knew what I was capable of. She thought I was weak and naive and easily dismissed. She was about to learn exactly how wrong she could be. But first, I had to figure out who I really was underneath. All the years of being the responsible sister, the one who made do with less, the one who never fought back. And I had to decide what kind of person I wanted to become. The kind who accepted humiliation quietly, or the kind who made sure it never happened again. The answer, as it turned out, would surprise everyone. Including me. Monday morning arrived. With the weight of 1,000 regrets pressing down on my chest. I woke up on my couch still wearing Victoria's dress, my makeup smeared across the throw pillow I'd been crying into most of the night. The events of Saturday evening played on repeat in my mind like a horror movie I couldn't turn off. Every cruel laugh, every condescending look, every word of Victoria's final assault echoed in the suffocating silence of my apartment. I called in sick to work, something I'd never done without actually being on death's door. But the thought of sitting in my windowless cubicle processing insurance claims while my coworkers inevitably asked about my weekend felt impossible. Instead, I spent the morning returning Victoria's dress and shoes, carefully packaging them in their original boxes with a note that simply said, "Thank you for letting me borrow these." I didn't apologize. I didn't explain. I didn't grovel for forgiveness like she probably expected me to. The silence from Victoria's end was deafening. No angry phone calls, no text messages demanding an explanation, no attempts at reconciliation. Just complete radio silence, as if Saturday night had never happened. As if I had never happened. It was somehow worse than her anger would have been. At least anger would have acknowledged that I mattered enough to be upset about. By Tuesday, I was back at work, trying to lose myself in the mind-numbing routine of processing medical claims. But something had changed. Every claim I processed told a story of human suffering that I'd never really paid attention to before. The grandmother who'd been denied coverage for her arthritis medication. The young father whose cancer treatment had been rejected as experimental. The diabetic teenager whose insurance company kept finding new ways to delay approving her insulin pump. These weren't abstract numbers on a screen anymore. They were people like me, people who couldn't afford to fight back against systems designed to profit from their desperation. People who had probably never been invited to dinner parties where their suffering was discussed as a business strategy over expensive wine. It was Thursday afternoon when everything changed. I was processing a particularly complex claim for a child with cystic fibrosis when my supervisor, Mrs. Martinez, appeared at my cubicle with an expression I'd never seen before. She was holding a manila folder and looking at me like she wasn't quite sure what to make of what she'd discovered. "Carmen, can you come to my office for a moment?" Her voice was carefully neutral, but there was something underneath it that made my stomach clench with anxiety. I followed her down the narrow hallway to her glass-walled office, my mind racing through every possible mistake I might have made. Had I processed something incorrectly? Violated some policy I wasn't aware of? Failed to meet some quota I didn't know existed? Mrs. Martinez closed the door behind us and gestured for me to sit. She was a small woman in her 50s who'd worked in medical billing for over 20 years, and she had the tired eyes of someone who'd seen too much bureaucratic cruelty disguised as policy. But today, those eyes held something that looked almost like excitement. "Carmen, how long have you been working here?" she asked, settling behind her desk and opening the manila folder. "About 18 months, I replied, confused by the question. She certainly knew how long I'd been there. "And in that time, have you ever noticed any patterns in the claims you process? Anything that seemed unusual or concerning?" I thought about the question seriously. The truth was, I'd started noticing patterns almost immediately, but I'd assumed that was just part of the job. The way certain insurance companies seemed to deny claims for specific medications with suspicious frequency. The way some pharmaceutical companies appeared to have special relationships with certain insurers that resulted in preferential treatment for their drugs. The way patients were often caught in the middle of financial arrangements they knew nothing about. "I guess I've noticed some things," I said carefully. "But I assumed that was normal. Part of how the system works." Mrs. Martinez leaned forward, her expression intense. "Carmen, what I'm about to tell you needs to stay between us for now. But I think you might have stumbled onto something significant." She opened the folder and pulled out several sheets of paper covered in data and analysis that looked far more sophisticated than anything our department usually produced. "For the past few months, I've been tracking some irregularities in our claim processing patterns. Nothing dramatic, just small inconsistencies that didn't quite add up. But when I started digging deeper, I found something interesting. She spread the papers across her desk, pointing to various highlighted sections. There's a pattern of coordination between certain insurance companies and pharmaceutical manufacturers that goes beyond normal business relationships. I stared at the documents, trying to understand what she was showing me. What kind of coordination? The kind that might be illegal, she said quietly. Price fixing, market manipulation, coordinated denial of claims to pressure patients into using more expensive alternatives. The kind of thing that could result in federal charges if we could prove it. My mouth went dry. And you think I've been processing claims related to this? I think you've been processing evidence of this, she corrected. Your work has been incredibly thorough, Carmen. More thorough than anyone else in the department. You've been documenting inconsistencies and patterns that other processors might have missed or ignored. You've been building a case without even knowing it. She pulled out another document, this one with my name at the top. I've been watching your work for months now, and I have to ask, did you do this intentionally? Are you deliberately tracking these patterns? I thought about all the late nights I'd stayed in the office, double-checking claims that seemed suspicious. All the extra notes I'd made in files when something didn't feel right. All the times I'd gone above and beyond what was required because I couldn't stand the thought of someone being denied care due to a mistake or oversight on my part. Not exactly, I said slowly. I couldn't stand the thought of making a mistake that might hurt someone. So I started being extra careful. Documenting everything. Following up on things that seemed wrong. Mrs. Martinez smiled for the first time since I'd entered her office. Carmen, what you've been doing isn't just careful. It's investigative work. High-quality investigative work that's uncovered what might be one of the largest healthcare fraud schemes in Louisiana. History. The room seemed to spin around me. Healthcare fraud? I've been in touch with the state attorney general's office, she continued, her voice dropping even lower. They're very interested in what we've found. But they need someone who understands the data, someone who can explain how the patterns work and what they mean for patients. Someone who's been tracking this from the inside. You want me to talk to the attorney general's office? I want you to consider becoming a whistleblower, she said directly. This could be big, Carmen. The kind of investigation that makes national news. The kind that results in serious criminal charges and massive financial penalties. The kind that actually changes things for the better. I sat back in my chair, my mind reeling. 3 days ago, I'd been the embarrassing sister who didn't understand how the world worked. Now I was being told that I'd accidentally uncovered a major criminal conspiracy? It felt surreal, like something that happened to other people in movies. What would that mean? I asked. Being a whistleblower? Mrs. Martinez's expression grew serious. It would mean your life changes completely. There would be interviews, depositions, possibly testifying in court. Your name would eventually become public. And there would be risks. These are powerful people. With a lot to lose. But there would also be protections, she continued. Federal whistleblower laws, witness protection if necessary. And if the case is successful, there could be significant financial compensation. We're talking about potentially billions of dollars in fraudulent claims. I thought about Victoria's dinner party, about the casual way those people had dismissed the suffering their pricing caused. About Mrs. Bordeaux's whispered certainty. That profit justified any price. About Richard's confident assertion that pharmaceutical companies weren't charities and couldn't be expected to consider moral calculations. How long do I have to decide? I asked. The Attorney General's office would like to meet with you next week if you're interested. But Carmen, this isn't a decision to make lightly. Once you start down this path, there's no going back. Your relationship with the pharmaceutical industry, with healthcare companies, with people like your sister's friends, all of that would change permanently. My sister. I hadn't told Mrs. Martinez about Victoria's career, about Richard's position in the industry, about the dinner party that had started this whole emotional journey. As far as she knew, I was just a dedicated employee who'd stumbled onto something significant through careful work. But I was beginning to realize that nothing about this was coincidence. My concern for patients, my attention to detail, my refusal to accept that suffering was just the cost of doing business, these weren't character flaws like Victoria had suggested. They were exactly the qualities that had led me to uncover something that could actually make a difference. Can I think about it over the weekend? I asked. Of course, Mrs. Martinez said, gathering up the documents. But Carmen, I want you to know that regardless of what you decide, I'm proud of the work you've done here. You've shown integrity and dedication that's rare in any profession. I walked back to my cubicle in a daze, staring at my computer screen. Without really seeing it. The claims I'd been processing for months suddenly looked different, charged with new meaning. Each denial, each delay, each bureaucratic obstacle wasn't just paperwork anymore. It was evidence. Evidence of a system that prioritized profit over people, that treated human suffering as an acceptable cost of doing business. That evening, I sat in my apartment surrounded by copies of the work I'd been doing without realizing its significance. Spreadsheets tracking denial patterns, notes about suspicious claim rejections, documentation of coordinated delays that seemed designed to force patients into more expensive treatment options. It was all there, laid out in meticulous detail, painting a picture of systemic fraud that went far beyond what I'd imagined possible. I thought about calling my mother, but what would I say? That her daughter, the family disappointment, might actually be sitting on information that could bring down major corporations? That the job Victoria had dismissed as dead-end billing might be the key to exposing the kind of corruption that destroyed families like ours? Instead, I found myself researching whistleblower cases online, reading about people who'd risked everything to expose wrongdoing. Some had been vindicated, celebrated as heroes who'd stood up to powerful interests. Others had been destroyed, their careers ruined and their lives turned upside down by people with unlimited resources and no scruples about how they used them. But what struck me most was how many of these whistleblowers talked about the moment they decided to come forward. It wasn't usually about money or fame or revenge. It was about being unable to live with themselves if they stayed silent. About reaching a point where keeping quiet felt like being complicit in the harm being done. I thought about the diabetic teenager whose insulin pump had been denied. About the grandmother who'd cried when her arthritis medication was rejected. About the young father whose cancer treatment had been dismissed as experimental. About the thousands of people whose claims I'd processed over the past 18 months, each one representing a human being caught between corporate greed and medical necessity. And I thought about Victoria's dinner party, about the casual way those people had dismissed concerns about pricing as naive idealism. About how they'd laughed at the suggestion that moral calculations should play any role in business decisions. About how they'd made it clear that people like me, people who couldn't afford their medications, people who worked in billing rather than development, people who shopped at thrift stores, simply didn't matter. By Friday afternoon, I'd made my decision. I called Mrs. Martinez and told her I wanted to meet with the Attorney General's office. She scheduled the meeting for the following Monday and promised to be there to support me through the initial interview. She also gave me the contact information for a lawyer who specialized in whistleblower cases, someone who could help me understand my rights and protections. That weekend, I did something I'd never done before. I went shopping for clothes that made me feel powerful instead of invisible. Not expensive clothes, I still couldn't afford Victoria's World, but clothes that fit well and made me feel confident. A sharp black blazer from a consignment shop. Well-tailored pants that actually fit my curves. Shoes that were comfortable but professional. Simple jewelry that looked deliberate rather than apologetic. I also did something else I'd never done. I got my hair cut by a real stylist instead of trying to trim it myself in my bathroom mirror. I told her I wanted something that looked serious and professional, something that would command respect in a room full of lawyers and investigators. She gave me a sleek bob that framed my face and made my dark eyes look larger and more intense. The woman who looked back at me from the salon mirror was someone I barely recognized. Not because she looked so different, but because she looked so confident. So determined. So completely unashamed of who she was and what she believed in. Sunday evening, I called my mother for the first time since the dinner party. I didn't tell her about the investigation or the Attorney General's office or any of the specifics. But I did tell her that some things at work had changed and that I might be taking on some new responsibilities that could be very important. "Carmen, honey, you sound different," she said, and there was something in her voice that might have been pride. "You sound stronger." "I feel stronger, Mom," I replied, and realized it was true. "Good," she said firmly. "It's about time. You've spent too many years letting people treat you like you don't matter. Your father always said you had more strength. Then you knew. Maybe it's time to show them he was right." After I hung up, I sat in my apartment looking around at the space that had felt so small and shabby just a week ago. It still wasn't much, but it felt different now. It felt like a launching pad rather than a prison. Like the place where I'd figured out who I really was underneath all the years of being dismissed and underestimated. Monday morning, I put on my new blazer and looked at myself in the mirror one last time. The woman looking back at me wasn't the one who'd stumbled through Victoria's dinner party in borrowed clothes, desperately trying to fit in where she didn't belong. This was someone who belonged exactly where she was, who had something important to offer, who couldn't be dismissed or ignored. I was about to walk into the Attorney General's office and potentially change the course of my entire life. I was about to become the kind of person who fought back instead of accepting humiliation quietly. I was about to discover what happened when you stopped being grateful for scraps and started demanding the whole meal. The meeting was scheduled for 10 a.m., and I arrived 15 minutes early. The Louisiana Attorney General's office was housed in an imposing building downtown, all marble and brass and the kind of architectural authority designed to remind you that serious business happened here. I sat in the waiting area, reviewing my notes one last time and trying to calm the nervous energy that had been building in my chest since I'd made the decision to come forward. Mrs. Martinez arrived exactly on time, carrying a briefcase full of the evidence we'd compiled over the past few months. She sat beside me and squeezed my hand reassuringly. "You ready for this, Carmen?" she asked quietly. I thought about the question seriously. Was I ready to potentially upend my entire life? Ready to take on corporations with unlimited resources and no conscience? Ready to become the kind of person who couldn't be ignored or dismissed? "Yes," I said, and meant it completely. "I'm ready." The receptionist called my name, and I stood up on steady legs, walking toward the conference room where my new life was waiting. Behind me, I could feel the weight of all the claims I'd processed, all the people who'd been denied care, all the suffering that had been treated as acceptable collateral damage in someone else's profit margins. Ahead of me was the unknown. But for the first time in years, the unknown didn't scare me. It excited me. Because I was finally about to become the person I was meant to be all along. The person who fought back. The conference room at the Attorney General's office was smaller than I'd expected, but the gravity of what was happening there made it feel enormous. 3 people sat across from Mrs. Martinez and me: Deputy Attorney General Patricia Hernandez, a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s with silver-streaked hair and the kind of presence that commanded immediate respect; Investigator David Chen, younger, but with the focused intensity of someone who'd spent years building complex cases; and Sarah Williams, a federal prosecutor who'd been brought in specifically for healthcare fraud cases. They listened without interruption as I walked them through 18 months of data, explaining the patterns I'd noticed, the inconsistencies that had bothered me, the systematic denials that seemed coordinated across multiple insurance companies and pharmaceutical manufacturers. Mrs. Martinez provided context and corroboration, showing how my individual observations fit into a larger pattern of potential fraud that spanned multiple states and involved billions of dollars in suspicious claims. When I finished my presentation, the room was quiet for a long moment. Finally, Deputy Attorney General Hernandez leaned forward, her expression serious but impressed. "Ms. Delacroix, what you've documented here is extraordinary. The level of detail, the comprehensive nature of your analysis, the clear pattern of coordination between supposedly independent entities, this is exactly the kind of evidence we need to build a case that could have national implications." Investigator Chen nodded in agreement. "I've been tracking healthcare fraud for 8 years, and I've rarely seen documentation this thorough from someone who wasn't specifically trained in investigative techniques. You have a natural instinct for this kind of work. The question now," said Prosecutor Williams, "is whether you're prepared for what comes next. Because if we move forward with this investigation, your life is going to change dramatically. These corporations have unlimited resources and no qualms about using them to destroy anyone who threatens their profit margins." I thought about Victoria's dinner party, about the casual cruelty of people who saw human suffering as an acceptable cost of doing business. I thought about the thousands of claims I'd processed, each one representing someone who'd been denied care they desperately needed. I thought about the person I'd been becoming over the past week, someone who couldn't stay silent in the face of injustice. "I understand the risks," I said quietly. "But I also understand what happens if I do nothing. People continue to suffer while criminals profit from their desperation. I can't live with that." Deputy Attorney General Hernandez smiled for the first time since I'd entered the room. "Then let's talk about what happens next." The next 6 months of my life became a whirlwind of depositions, interviews, document analysis, and collaboration with federal investigators from multiple agencies. The scope of the fraud we'd uncovered was even larger than anyone had initially suspected, involving not just the companies I'd identified but an entire network of corporations that had been systematically manipulating healthcare markets for over a decade. My role evolved from whistleblower to key witness to something approaching lead investigator. My background in medical billing, combined with my attention to detail and instinct for patterns, made me uniquely qualified to help prosecutors understand the technical aspects of the fraud. I worked closely with FBI financial crime specialists, explaining how insurance claims were processed and where the vulnerabilities in the system allowed for manipulation. The work was intense and often overwhelming, but it was also exhilarating in a way I'd never experienced before. For the first time in my life, I was doing work that felt genuinely important, work that could make a real difference in people's lives. I was being paid consultant fees that were more than I'd ever made in billing, and more importantly, I was being treated with the kind of respect and professional recognition I'd never thought possible. My transformation wasn't just professional. The confident, determined woman who'd walked into that first meeting continued to evolve. I enrolled in evening classes in business law and healthcare policy, hungry to understand the systems I was helping to investigate. I joined a gym and started taking care of my physical health with the same dedication I brought to my work. I moved to a better apartment, not because I was making more money but because I finally felt like I deserved better. Most significantly, I maintained complete radio silence with Victoria and her world. When she eventually called, 3 weeks after my first meeting with the Attorney General's office, I let it go to voicemail. Her message was everything I'd expected: concern about my strange behavior, questions about why I'd missed family dinner at Mom's house, casual mentions of job opportunities in Richard's company if I was finally ready to grow up and join the real world. I deleted the message without responding. 2 months later, she called again. This time, there was an edge to her voice that I'd never heard before. Apparently, rumors were circulating in her professional circles about a major healthcare fraud investigation. Nothing specific, but enough to make people nervous. She wanted to know if I'd heard anything at work, if there was anything she should know about. I deleted that message too. It was in month 4 of the investigation that everything began to accelerate. The federal task force had gathered enough evidence to begin preparing indictments, and my role as a key witness was becoming more prominent. I was working directly with prosecutors to help them understand the technical aspects of the fraud scheme, preparing for what would likely be months of testimony in multiple trials. That's when I got the call that changed everything. It was Deputy Attorney General Hernandez, and her voice carried an excitement I'd never heard before. "Carmen, we need to meet. Tonight if possible. There's been a development in the case that you need to know about." We met at a quiet restaurant far from downtown, the kind of place where serious conversations could happen without being overheard. Hernandez arrived with a briefcase full of documents and an expression that was equal parts triumph and concern. "Carmen, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me," she began. "Do you have any family members who work in the pharmaceutical industry?" My stomach dropped. My sister Victoria works in pharmaceutical sales. Her husband Richard is an executive at MedTech Solutions. Why? Hernandez opened her briefcase and pulled out a series of photographs and documents. Because MedTech Solutions is one of the primary targets of our investigation. And according to these financial records, Richard Beaumont has been personally involved in coordinating the price-fixing scheme we've been tracking. The photographs showed Richard at meetings with executives from other pharmaceutical companies. Documents with his signature authorizing payments that appeared to be bribes to insurance company executives, email communications discussing strategies for manipulating market prices. It was all there, laid out in devastating detail. "There's more," Hernandez continued. "We have evidence that Richard has been using his wife's connections in the sales division to facilitate some of these arrangements. Victoria may not have been directly involved in the criminal conspiracy, but she's been unknowingly providing access and information that made the fraud possible." I stared at the documents, feeling a mixture of vindication and horror. The people who'd humiliated me at that dinner party, who'd dismissed my concerns as naive idealism, who'd treated me like I didn't understand how the world worked, they were criminals. They were exactly the kind of people my investigation was designed to expose and prosecute. "What does this mean for the case?" I asked. "It means we have enough evidence to secure convictions on federal racketeering charges," Hernandez replied. "Richard is looking at potentially 20 years in federal prison. The other executives involved could face similar sentences. And the financial penalties could run into the billions." "What does this mean for Victoria?" Hernandez's expression grew more serious. "That depends on what she knew and when she knew it. We have evidence that she was present at social gatherings where business was discussed, that she had access to information that would have made the conspiracy obvious to someone in her position. If we can prove she was aware of the illegal activities and failed to report them, she could face charges for conspiracy and obstruction of justice." I thought about Victoria's dinner party, about the casual ways she and her friends had discussed market manipulation and price coordination. At the time, I'd been horrified by their indifference to human suffering. Now I was realizing that their conversations might have been criminal confessions disguised as cocktail party chatter. "What happens next?" I asked. "The indictments are being unsealed next week," Hernandez said. "There will be coordinated arrests across multiple states. Federal agents will be executing search warrants on corporate offices and private residences. This is going to be front-page news for months." She leaned forward, her expression intense. "Carmen, I need you to understand something. When this goes public, your role as the whistleblower will eventually become known. Your sister and her husband will figure out that you're the person who brought their world crashing down. Are you prepared for that?" I thought about the question seriously. Was I prepared to be the person who destroyed my sister's marriage? Her career, her perfect life? Was I prepared to be the family member who chose justice over loyalty, truth over keeping peace? 6 months ago, I would have said no, I replied. 6 months ago, I would have kept quiet to preserve family relationships, to avoid conflict, to maintain the fiction that we were all one big happy family. But 6 months ago, I was also the person who accepted humiliation quietly and was grateful for scraps. I met Hernandez's eyes directly. The person I am now understands that sometimes doing the right thing means being willing to make enemies. Even family enemies. The arrests began at dawn on a Tuesday morning. I watched the news from my apartment, seeing federal agents leading Richard out of his office in handcuffs, perp-walking executives from companies whose names I'd been tracking for months. The scope of the operation was breathtaking: over 40 arrests across 12 states, search warrants executed at corporate headquarters and private residences, financial assets frozen pending investigation. My phone started ringing at 6 a.m. and didn't stop for the rest of the day. Reporters who'd somehow gotten my number, colleagues from my old job, distant relatives who'd seen the news and wondered if I knew anything about it. I let them all go to voicemail. The only call I answered was from my mother. "Carmen, honey, are you seeing the news? They arrested Richard this morning. Victoria is beside herself. She keeps asking if anyone in the family knows anything about this investigation." There was a pause, and I could hear the wheels turning in my mother's mind. "Carmen, that important work you mentioned, the new responsibilities at your job, this wouldn't have anything to do with that, would it?" I took a deep breath. "Yes, Mom, it would." The silence that followed stretched for nearly a minute. When my mother finally spoke, her voice was quiet but firm. "Are you safe?" "Yes, I'm safe. I'm protected." "Are you doing the right thing?" I thought about all the people whose claims I'd processed, all the suffering I'd documented, all the evidence of systematic fraud that prioritized profit over human life. "Yes, Mom. I'm doing the right thing." "Then I'm proud of you," she said, and I could hear her crying. "Your father would be proud too. You found your strength, baby girl. You found your voice." Victoria called an hour later. When I saw her name on my phone, I almost didn't answer. But I realized that this conversation had been inevitable since the moment I'd decided to come forward. It was time to finish what had started at her dinner party 6 months ago. "Carmen?" Her voice was shaking, desperate. "Carmen, please tell me you had nothing to do with this. Please tell me my own sister didn't destroy my family." "I didn't destroy your family, Victoria," I said calmly. "Your family destroyed itself through criminal behavior. I just documented it." The scream that came through the phone was primal, full of rage and disbelief and terror. "How could you do this to us? How could you do this to me? I'm your sister." "You're right," I replied. "You are my sister. The sister who told a room full of strangers that I embarrassed her. The sister who said I shopped at thrift stores like it was a moral failing. The sister who made it clear that I didn't belong in your world because I cared about people who couldn't afford their medications." That was just dinner party conversation. That wasn't real. "It was real to me," I said, and for the first time in our conversation, my voice carried emotion. "Every word you said was real to me. Every laugh from your friends was real to me. Every moment of humiliation you put me through was absolutely real. So you decided to destroy my entire life over hurt feelings?" The question hung in the air between us, and I realized this was the moment Victoria would either understand what she'd done or reveal that she never would. "I didn't destroy your life over hurt feelings, Victoria. I exposed criminal fraud that was destroying thousands of other people's lives. The fact that your husband was one of the criminals responsible isn't about our family drama. It's about justice." "Justice?" Her voice was getting shriller. "You want to talk about justice? I gave you opportunities, Carmen. I invited you into my world, introduced you to important people. I tried to help you become something more than a glorified data entry clerk, and this is how you repay me?" And there it was. Even now, even with her world collapsing around her, Victoria still saw herself as the generous sister who'd tried to help her poor relation. She still couldn't see that her help had been condescending charity designed to make her feel better about herself rather than actually supporting me. "You didn't give me opportunities, Victoria. You gave me humiliation disguised as kindness. You invited me to that dinner party so you could show your friends how generous you were to your pathetic sister, and when I didn't play the grateful victim role perfectly, you destroyed me publicly." "I never meant." "Yes, you did," I interrupted. "You meant every word. You meant to put me in my place. You meant to remind everyone in that room that I was beneath them. You meant to make sure I understood that my concerns about human suffering were naive and unwelcome." The silence that followed was longer this time. When Victoria spoke again, Her voice was smaller, more vulnerable than I'd heard it since we were children. Carmen, please. Richard could go to prison for 20 years. We're going to lose everything. The house, our savings, everything we've built. The kids don't understand what's happening. Emma keeps asking why Daddy was on television. In handcuffs. For just a moment, I felt the old instinct to comfort her, to put her needs above my own principles, to sacrifice my sense of justice for family peace. It would have been so easy to express sympathy, to offer support, to pretend that her pain mattered more than the pain Richard had caused to thousands of other families. But I wasn't that person anymore. Victoria, do you know what it's like to choose between insulin and rent? Do you know what it's like to watch your spouse die because you can't afford the medication that could save them? Do you know what it's like to be told that your child's cancer treatment is too expensive for your insurance to cover? That's not the same thing, it's exactly the same thing, I said firmly. Those are the families your husband destroyed with his fraud. Those are the people who suffered so Richard could afford your mansion and your designer clothes and your perfect dinner parties. And you knew, Victoria. Deep down, you knew that the money funding your lifestyle came from other people's desperation. I didn't know it was illegal, you didn't want to know, I corrected. There's a difference. You didn't want to ask uncomfortable questions about how pharmaceutical companies could afford to charge dying people thousands of dollars for medications that cost pennies to produce. You didn't want to examine the moral implications of your comfortable life. The crying started then, deep sobs that might have been genuine remorse or might have been self-pity. It was impossible to tell, and I realized it didn't matter. Victoria's tears couldn't undo the harm that had been done, couldn't restore the lives that had been lost to greed, couldn't justify staying silent about criminal behavior. What am I supposed to do now? She whispered. You're supposed to face the consequences of your choices, I replied. Just like all those families you never thought about had to face the consequences of your husband's fraud. Carmen, please. I know I hurt you, but we're family. Family is supposed to forgive each other. Family is supposed to stick together. And there was the final manipulation, the last attempt to use family loyalty to escape accountability. 6 months ago, it might have worked. 6 months ago, I might have sacrificed justice for the illusion of family unity. You're right that family is supposed to stick together, I said. Family is supposed to support each other, protect each other, lift each other up. But you threw that away when you chose to humiliate me publicly rather than stand by me. You threw it away when you decided that your reputation mattered more than my dignity. I'm sorry, she said, and for the first time, she sounded like she might actually mean it. I'm genuinely sorry for how I treated you. I was wrong. I believe you, I replied. But being sorry doesn't undo the harm. And it doesn't change the fact that you and Richard committed crimes that destroyed innocent people's lives. My job isn't to be your sister anymore, Victoria. My job is to make sure justice is served. So that's it? Her voice was getting stronger again, anger replacing desperation. You're going to send my husband to prison and destroy my children's lives, and you feel good about that? I feel good about stopping criminals from profiting off human suffering, I said. How you and your children are affected by Richard's choices is unfortunate, but it's not my responsibility to minimize the consequences of his crimes. You've changed, she said, and there was something like recognition in her voice finally. You're not the same person. No, I agreed. I'm not. The person I was 6 months ago would have stayed quiet to keep peace. She would have accepted humiliation rather than fight back. She would have prioritized family loyalty over justice. But that person died at your dinner party, Victoria. You killed her with your cruelty and your casual dismissal of human suffering. And who are you now? I thought about the question seriously. Who was I now? I was someone who couldn't be dismissed or ignored. Someone who fought for people. Who couldn't fight for themselves. Someone who understood that real strength meant being willing to stand alone for what was right. I'm someone who matters, I said finally. I'm someone whose voice can't be silenced by shame or intimidation. I'm someone who chooses justice over comfort, truth over family loyalty, principle over popularity. I don't recognize you anymore. Good, I replied. That means the transformation is complete. I hung up without saying goodbye and turned off my phone. Outside my apartment window, New Orleans continued its daily rhythm, unaware that one of its residents had just chosen to become someone entirely new. The trials began 8 months later and continued for nearly 2 years. I testified in federal court 17 times, explaining complex billing schemes to juries, walking prosecutors through evidence trails, helping to build cases that ultimately resulted in 43 criminal convictions and over $4 billion in financial penalties. Richard received a 22-year federal prison sentence and was ordered to pay restitution of over $50 million. Victoria was never charged criminally, but she lost everything in the civil forfeiture proceedings. The mansion was seized, their bank accounts frozen, their children's college funds confiscated as proceeds of criminal activity. She divorced Richard while he was awaiting sentencing and moved back to our hometown with Emma and Jake, living in a small apartment and working as a receptionist at a medical clinic. The irony wasn't lost on me that she now spent her days helping people navigate the same healthcare system her husband had exploited for profit. My mother and I rebuilt our relationship slowly and carefully. She never asked me to reconcile with Victoria, never suggested that family loyalty should override my commitment to justice. Instead, she told me repeatedly how proud she was that I'd found the strength to stand up for what was right, even when it cost me everything I'd thought I wanted. As for me, my role in the investigation led to opportunities I'd never imagined possible. The federal government offered me a position as a consultant on healthcare fraud cases. Universities invited me to speak about ethics in medical billing. Advocacy groups asked me to help them understand how systematic fraud affected patient care. I chose to start my own consulting firm, specializing in helping organizations identify and prevent healthcare fraud. My client list grew to include insurance companies, pharmaceutical manufacturers, and government agencies, all eager to work with someone who understood both the technical aspects of medical billing and the human cost of corruption. The work was lucrative, meaningful, and challenging in ways that my old job had never been. But more importantly, it was work that aligned with my values, work that made a difference in people's lives, work that couldn't be dismissed or minimized by people who thought they were better than me. 5 years after Victoria's dinner party, I was invited to speak at a healthcare ethics conference in Chicago. The audience was filled with exactly the kind of people who'd been at that dinner party: pharmaceutical executives, insurance company leaders, medical device manufacturers. The kind of people who'd once laughed at my concerns about pricing and human suffering. But this time, I wasn't the naive sister who didn't understand how the world worked. I was the keynote speaker, the expert they'd come to hear, the person whose investigations had reshaped their entire industry. I stood at that podium in a designer suit I'd bought with money I'd earned through my own expertise, looking out at an audience that hung on my every word. My speech was about the human cost of healthcare fraud, about the families destroyed by greed, about the importance of choosing ethics over profit. I talked about real people whose lives had been saved because criminals were prevented from manipulating the system. I talked about the responsibility that came with holding people's lives in your hands. When I finished, the standing ovation lasted for 3 minutes. Afterward, executives lined up to shake my hand, to get my business card, to ask if I'd consider consulting for their companies. These were people who now needed my approval, my expertise, my validation. One man waited until the crowd had thinned before approaching me. He was older, distinguished, with the kind of confidence that came from decades of success in corporate boardrooms. "Ms. Delacroix," he said, extending his hand, "that was an extraordinary presentation. I'm James Morrison, CEO of Morrison Pharmaceuticals. I wonder if we might discuss bringing you in as a consultant on our compliance programs." I shook his hand politely, noting the expensive watch, the perfect suit, the assumption that I would be honored by his interest. "I'd be happy to discuss that, Mr. Morrison. Though I should mention that my consulting fees start at $5,000 per day, and I require complete transparency in all financial arrangements." His eyebrows rose slightly at the fee structure, but he nodded. "Of course. Someone with your expertise commands premium compensation." As he walked away, I realized that I'd become exactly what Victoria had always insisted I could never be: someone who commanded respect. Someone whose expertise was valued, someone who mattered in the world of powerful people and important decisions. But I'd achieved it by becoming the opposite of what she'd wanted me to be. Instead of learning to accept the system and profit from its cruelties, I'd learned to challenge it and hold it accountable. Instead of becoming grateful for whatever scraps were offered, I'd learned to demand what I was worth. Instead of staying quiet to keep peace, I'd learned to speak truth, regardless of the consequences. That evening, I had dinner alone at an expensive restaurant overlooking the Chicago River. As I sat there, enjoying a meal that cost more than I used to make in a week, I thought about the journey that had brought me to this moment. The humiliation that had sparked transformation. The sister who'd tried to diminish me and had instead unleashed someone she couldn't control or contain. My phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. For a moment, I wondered if it might be Victoria, trying once again to bridge the gap between us. But when I opened it, the message was from Emma, my niece, now 18 and starting college. "Aunt Carmen, I saw your speech online. I just wanted you to know that I'm proud of what you did. I understand now why you had to choose justice over family. I hope someday I'll be as brave as you are." I stared at the message for a long time, feeling something settle in my chest that might have been peace. The next generation understood. They would grow up in a world where people like me fought back, where corruption had consequences, where standing up for what was right mattered more than keeping peace with family. I typed back a simple response: be braver than I was. Don't wait for someone to humiliate you into finding your strength. You already have everything you need. As I walked back to my hotel that night, I passed my reflection in a shop window and smiled at the woman looking back at me. She was successful, respected, financially secure, and professionally accomplished. But more than that, she was someone who'd learned that the most important victory wasn't defeating your enemies, it was becoming someone they could never defeat again. Victoria had tried to teach me that I was used to making do with less, that I should be grateful for whatever scraps were offered, that I didn't understand how the world really worked. She'd been wrong about everything except one thing: I really hadn't understood how the world worked. Now I did. And I'd learned to make it work for me. 10 years had passed since that dinner party changed everything, and I was sitting in my corner office on the 32nd floor of a downtown Chicago high-rise, looking out at Lake Michigan while reviewing proposals from 3 different pharmaceutical companies that wanted to hire my firm. The irony wasn't lost on me that I now occupied the kind of office that would have intimidated me beyond measure a decade ago, and that the companies begging for my services were exactly the type that had once dismissed me as irrelevant. My consulting firm, Delacroix Healthcare Ethics, had become the gold standard for compliance consulting in the pharmaceutical industry. We employed 47 people across 6 offices, and our client list read like a who's who of major healthcare corporations. But more than the success, what satisfied me most was the work itself. Every day, we prevented the kind of fraud that had once seemed unstoppable. Every contract we negotiated included protections for patients that wouldn't have existed without our intervention. Every compliance program we designed made it harder for criminals to profit from human suffering. The morning had started like many others, with a steady stream of meetings, contract reviews, and strategic planning sessions. But it was interrupted by a call from my assistant, Maria, whose voice carried an unusual tension. "Ms. Delacroix, there's someone here to see you. She doesn't have an appointment, but she says she's your sister, Victoria Beaumont." I hadn't seen or spoken to Victoria in 7 years, not since Richard's sentencing hearing where she'd sat in the back of the courtroom glaring at me while I testified about the scope of his crimes. The last I'd heard, she was still living in our hometown, working at the medical clinic, struggling to rebuild her life from the ashes of her former existence. "Send her up," I said, curious about what could have brought her to my office after all these years. Victoria looked smaller than I remembered, older and worn down by years of financial struggle and social exile. Her once perfect blonde hair was showing gray at the roots, and her clothes were clearly off the rack rather than designer. But there was something in her posture, something in the way she carried herself, that suggested this wasn't the broken woman who'd begged me for help during Richard's trial. "Hello, Carmen," she said, settling into the chair across from my desk. "Thank you for seeing me." "I have to admit, I'm surprised you're here," I replied, studying her face for clues about her motivation. "It's been a long time." 7 years? 4 months, and 16 days, she said precisely. "But who's counting?" We sat in silence for a moment, 2 sisters who'd once shared everything now separated by choices that couldn't be undone. Finally, Victoria spoke again. "I came to tell you something I should have said years ago," she began, her voice steady but quiet. "You were right. About everything. About Richard, about the industry, about the way we treated people suffering. Like it was just the cost of doing business. You were right, and I was too proud and too scared to admit it." I waited, not trusting myself to respond immediately. Victoria had apologized before, during the crisis, but those apologies had felt desperate and self-serving. This felt different. "I've spent the last 7 years working at that clinic," she continued. "Do you know what it's like to watch a diabetic teenager ration insulin because her family can't afford a full prescription? Do you know what it's like to see a mother cry because her insurance won't cover her child's asthma medication?" She looked directly at me for the first time since entering my office. "Every day, I see the human cost of the system Richard helped create. Every day, I remember that dinner party where we laughed at your concerns like they were naive idealism. Every day, I understand a little more why you had to do what you did." "Why are you telling me this now?" I asked. Victoria reached into her purse and pulled out a manila folder, placing it on my desk. "Because I want to help. I want to make amends for what Richard did, for what I enabled, for the years I spent profiting from other people's misery." I opened the folder and found documents I recognized immediately: internal communications from pharmaceutical companies, pricing strategies, market manipulation plans. But these weren't historical documents from Richard's case. These were current, dated within the last 6 months. "Where did you get these?" I asked, looking up at Victoria with new attention. The clinic where I work contracts with several pharmaceutical companies for patient assistance programs, she explained. Over the years, I've developed relationships with people in various companies. People who remember me from the old days. Who trust me because they think I'm just Richard's harmless ex-wife trying to make ends meet. She leaned forward, and I could see an intensity in her eyes that reminded me of myself during the early days of my investigation. They talk to me, Carmen. They tell me things they shouldn't. They complain about practices they know are wrong but feel powerless to stop. And I've been documenting everything. I flipped through the documents more carefully, recognizing patterns that looked disturbingly familiar. Price coordination between supposedly competing companies. Kickback schemes disguised as consulting agreements. Market manipulation designed to maximize profits while minimizing competition. This looks like the same kind of fraud we exposed 10 years ago, I said. It is, Victoria replied. They learned to be more careful, more sophisticated, but the fundamental corruption never stopped. They just got better at hiding it. I studied my sister's face, looking for signs of manipulation or hidden agenda. But what I saw was something I'd never expected, genuine remorse combined with determined purpose. Victoria had changed, fundamentally and completely, in ways that went far beyond appearance or circumstances. What do you want from me? I asked. I want to be your inside source, she said without hesitation. I want to help you expose these new schemes the way you exposed Richard's. I want to spend whatever time I have left making up for the damage I helped cause. Victoria, you understand what you're proposing? If we move forward with this, if we build another case, your role will eventually become public. The people who trust you now will see you as a traitor. You'll be blacklisted from the industry entirely. She smiled, and it was the first genuine smile I'd seen from her since we were children. Good. I don't want to be trusted by criminals. I don't want to be welcome in an industry that profits from human suffering. I want to be the kind of person my children can be proud of. What do Emma and Jake think about this? Emma knows, Victoria said. She's 23 now, working as a social worker in New Orleans. She understands why you did what you did, and she supports what I'm trying to do now. Jake is still angry about everything that happened, but he's young. Hopefully, he'll understand someday. I looked at the documents again, then back at Victoria. The sister who'd once humiliated me for caring about people's suffering was now asking to risk everything to expose the same kind of corruption. The woman who'd prioritized reputation over justice was now willing to sacrifice whatever reputation she had left to do the right thing. If we do this, I said slowly, it has to be done right. No shortcuts, no emotional decisions, no family considerations. That compromised the investigation. Can you handle that? I've been handling it for 2 years, she replied. This folder represents just a small sample of what I've collected. I have recordings, financial documents, correspondence between executives discussing illegal strategies. I've been building a case, Carmen. I just needed someone with the expertise to know what to do with it. Over the following months, Victoria and I developed a working relationship that was nothing like the sisterhood we'd once shared. This was professional, focused, and built on mutual respect rather than family obligation. She continued working at the clinic, using her position to gather evidence and maintain her cover, while I worked with federal prosecutors to build a case around the information she provided. The investigation that emerged was even larger than the one that had brought down Richard. We uncovered a network of corruption that spanned dozens of companies and involved billions of dollars in fraudulent schemes. The pattern was sophisticated and coordinated, suggesting that the industry had learned from previous prosecutions but had chosen to become more clever rather than more ethical. Victoria's transformation during this period was remarkable to witness. The woman who'd once been concerned primarily with appearances and social status became someone who could discuss complex legal strategies and investigate techniques with the kind of focus I'd once thought she was incapable of. She'd found her own sense of purpose, her own mission that went far beyond making amends for past mistakes. The breakthrough came 18 months into our collaboration. Victoria had been cultivating a relationship with a mid-level executive at Morrison Pharmaceuticals, the same company whose CEO had approached me after my Chicago speech years earlier. This executive, David Park, was feeling increasingly uncomfortable with practices he was being asked to implement and was looking for someone to confide in. He's ready to talk, Victoria told me during one of our weekly strategy meetings. But he's scared. He has a family, a mortgage, all the usual reasons people stay quiet about corporate crime. What's he offering? Everything, she said, her eyes bright with excitement. He's willing to wear a wire, copy documents, testify if necessary. He wants immunity in exchange for full cooperation. And what does he want from us? protection for his family, and a guarantee that his testimony will actually result in prosecutions. He doesn't want to destroy his life for nothing. I arranged a meeting between David Park and the federal prosecutors who'd been working the case. The evidence he provided was devastating: recorded conversations between executives discussing price-fixing arrangements, documents outlining strategies for market manipulation, financial records showing illegal payments disguised as legitimate business expenses. But the most damaging evidence was something we hadn't expected. Park had access to communications between Morrison Pharmaceuticals and several other major companies discussing a coordinated campaign to discredit and destroy healthcare fraud investigators. They'd identified key prosecutors, federal agents, and consultants, including me, and had developed strategies to undermine our credibility and effectiveness. "They're not just committing healthcare fraud," Prosecutor Williams explained during our briefing. "They're actively working to prevent detection and prosecution of healthcare fraud. This is obstruction of justice on a massive scale." The investigation culminated in coordinated raids across 12 states, resulting in over 60 arrests and the seizure of hundreds of millions of dollars in assets. Morrison Pharmaceuticals and 5 other major companies were indicted on federal racketeering charges. The CEO who'd once solicited my consulting services was arrested at his country club and charged with conspiracy, fraud, and obstruction of justice. Victoria's role in the investigation became public during the trial phase, when she testified about the culture of corruption she'd witnessed both as Richard's wife and as an undercover source. Her testimony was compelling not just because of the evidence she provided, but because of the personal transformation it represented. "I spent 15 years of my life believing that profit justified any price," she told the jury during her testimony. "I was married to a man who charged desperate families thousands of dollars for medications that cost pennies to produce, and I told myself that was just business. I socialized with people who treated human suffering as an acceptable cost of corporate success, and I never questioned whether we were the villains in someone else's story." She looked directly at the defendant's table as she continued. "It took losing everything, my marriage, my home, my social status, my financial security, to understand what my sister had been trying to tell me all along. That some things matter more than money. That some prices are too high to pay, no matter how much profit they generate. That being successful means nothing if your success comes from other people's misery." The convictions that followed were comprehensive and severe. The executives received sentences ranging from 15 to 25 years in federal prison. The companies involved faced financial penalties totaling over $8 billion. New regulations were implemented to prevent the kind of coordination between companies that had made the fraud possible. But perhaps the most significant outcome was the precedent it set for holding corporate executives personally accountable for healthcare fraud. The message was clear: profiting from human suffering would result in serious consequences, regardless of how sophisticated the scheme or how powerful the people involved. After the trials concluded, Victoria and I sat in my office one evening, looking out at the city lights and reflecting on the journey that had brought us to this point. She was leaving Chicago the next morning, returning to New Orleans to start a new job with a patient advocacy organization. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I hadn't humiliated you at that dinner party?" she asked quietly. I considered the question seriously. "Sometimes. But I think something else would have triggered the same realization eventually. I was already seeing the patterns in my work, already feeling uncomfortable with the system. Your dinner party just accelerated the timeline." "I'm glad," she said, and I could tell she meant it. "Not glad that I hurt you, but glad that it led to all this. Glad that Richard and people like him are in prison. Glad that the system is a little less corrupt because of what you did." "What we did," I corrected. "This last investigation wouldn't have been possible without your work." Victoria smiled, but there was sadness in it. "I know we can't go back to being sisters the way we were before," she said. "Too much has happened. Too many choices have been made. But I hope we can be something else. Colleagues, maybe. Partners in making the world a little better." "I'd like that," I replied, and realized I meant it. After Victoria left, I remained in my office, thinking about the path that had led me from that humiliating dinner party to this moment of professional triumph and personal resolution. The woman who'd once been grateful for scraps had become someone who demanded justice. The family member who'd once prioritized peace over principle had chosen truth over loyalty. The billing clerk who'd been dismissed as irrelevant had become someone whose voice couldn't be silenced. But perhaps most importantly, the sister who'd been humiliated by family had found a way to transform that humiliation into purpose, that pain into power, that betrayal into a mission that had changed thousands of lives for the better. The next morning, I received an email from Emma, Victoria's daughter, who was now working as a social worker in New Orleans. She was writing to thank me for giving her mother a chance to make amends, for showing her that people could change, for proving that it was never too late to choose the right side of history. I know it took courage to trust her again, Emma wrote. I know it would have been easier to keep her out of your life permanently. But giving her the chance to help. With this investigation didn't just expose corporate criminals, it gave my mother back her soul. She's the person now that I always hoped she could be. As I read those words, I understood that the most important victory hadn't been the prosecutions or the financial penalties or the new regulations. It had been the transformation of two sisters who'd learned, through pain and loss and hard-won wisdom, that family wasn't about unconditional loyalty or keeping peace at any cost. Real family was about holding each other accountable, supporting each other's growth, and sometimes loving each other enough to choose justice over comfort. We'd found our way back to each other not by ignoring the past, but by facing it honestly. And working together to create a better future. 10 years after Victoria had humiliated me at her dinner party, she had become my most trusted partner in the fight against the very corruption she'd once embodied. It was, I reflected, the most satisfying revenge I could have ever imagined, turning my enemy into an ally, transforming my humiliation into her redemption, and proving that people really could change when they finally understood what was at stake. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.